Good afternoon. I am Gary Allison. I'm Vice Dean at the University of Tulsa College of Law, and I welcome you to this most important conference and forum. And I want to turn the program over to Ms. Clara Hill, who is going to introduce our speaker today. First, I'd like to recognize Rodney Moses. Rodney, would you stand up? He's president of our Public Interest Law Society here. And that organization, that student organization, is a co-sponsor of today's program.
Hi, welcome to TU, and welcome, Sarah. Thank you for coming. Before I forget to tell you this, there are forms on your tables, and there's a pre and a post evaluation part. If you could fill out the pre part, that would be good, and then later you can fill out the post. And also we have little yellow note cards, and if you can hold it back, try and write your questions down on the note cards and then ask them at the end, so that we can just sort of get through the talk. So on behalf of the Oklahoma Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice, OKRCRC, I would like to welcome all of you. Thanks to the School of Law for providing the venue for our meeting, and the co-sponsors, including TU Public Interest Law, as was just mentioned, Oklahoma Coalition for Reproductive Justice, Oklahomans for Reproductive Justice, and the ACLU of Oklahoma. We very much appreciate their support and commitment to women's reproductive health. And thanks also to the other RCRC board members who are here. My name's Clara Hill. I'm a board member of RCRC. Our organization is an affiliate of a national coalition of mainstream religious organizations. Yes, we are religious. We are people of faith who firmly believe that no government, group, or individual can take away a woman's religious and constitutional right to reproductive freedom, which includes access to abortion. More than 40 different religious groups and denominations are members of our national organization, including Presbyterian, Episcopal, United Church of Christ, United Methodist Church, Unitarian Universalist, Judaism, Catholics for Choice, and Disciples for Choice. We represent mainstream people of faith on this issue, and we have become increasingly concerned about some of the activities of some crisis pregnancy centers. These are centers that provide services and education for women with unplanned pregnancies. We've received many complaints at our organization from women seeking abortions that these centers have intentionally misled them about the services that they provide. And I want to emphasize that I'm not here to debate when life begins or the morality of abortion or the morality of birth control. And I'm not here, and neither is Sarah, to condemn all crisis pregnancy centers. We're just here to share information on the deceptive practices of some crisis pregnancy centers that deliberately mislead women. So one note before introducing our speaker. No, I already said it. Pass out cards, answer questions, that's right. So no more notes. We're very pleased to have Sarah Ainsworth as our speaker. Ms. Ainsworth is a lecturer at the University of Washington School of Law in Seattle, which is one of my favorite schools, coincidentally. She received her Juris Doctor with honors from the law school in 1996. She's the co-founder and co-chair of the Public Interest Law Association and teaches courses on women's rights and social justice, including poverty law, reproductive rights, and justice. She currently serves as the Counsel Emerita for Legal Voice, an advocacy group working to advance the legal rights of women and their families. For 10 years, she served as staff attorney for the organization working to advance women's rights, especially in the areas of religious restrictions on women's access to health care and reproductive freedom. Ms. Ainsworth has developed and coordinated impact litigation advocating for legal rights of women and girls in Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, and Alaska. Her areas of specialty include violence against women, economic justice, and reproductive rights. She was admitted to the Washington State Bar in 1996 and the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in 2007. Ms. Ainsworth's presentation today is entitled Crisis Pregnancy Centers, Pregnancy and Deception. We're honored to have you with us. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. This is my first time in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and it is lovely. Do I need to speak up? Okay, are we better there? I think the microphone keeps dropping down past my height, okay. My first time in Tulsa, and the sunshine is gorgeous, so it's lovely to be here. I really appreciate it. And I want to thank all the people who organized this forum and invited me to come all the way from Seattle to participate in it. I wanted to reiterate what Clara asked. I'd like to go through my presentation today, and then we can take questions at the end, and I'll try to get through it quickly enough that we have some time for dialogue and discussion. Quickly, I'll give a little outline of what I'm going to talk about today, and then I'll jump in. First of all, I'll tell you a little bit more about Legal Voice, the organization that I work with in the Northwest. That organization has led local work around trying to regulate some of the deceptive practices of crisis pregnancy centers in Washington State. I'll also talk a little bit about the stories of women that I have talked to directly who had gone to crisis pregnancy centers and had negative experiences there. I'll tell you a little bit about the history of crisis pregnancy centers as a movement and the kind of tactics that they used when they were first formed, some legal responses to those tactics, and some of the tactics that some of them use now. Again, I will reiterate that we're talking about some crisis pregnancy centers, not all crisis pregnancy centers. I'll talk some more about how states, cities have responded currently. There's legislation that's been passed in some states around the country, legislation that's been proposed in other states. So I'll talk about that, and I'll talk about some of the legal responses to that as well. Lawsuits that were brought against those bills in certain cities, and the court decisions that have come down on those cases that are targeted around the First Amendment. I'll also talk a little bit about who's harmed, what women are at risk, which women go to crisis pregnancy centers, and what kind of life circumstances do they have, and what do we need to be concerned about around that. Finally, I'll talk about some positive outcomes from some of these legislative attempts, some of the problems that remain, and kind of where we can go forward from there. So with that, I work at Legal Voice, a nonprofit organization that was founded in 1978. At the time, it was called the Northwest Women's Law Center. And the organization was founded to advocate for women's legal rights, and it was formed around a particular lawsuit that was against Washington State University, actually, where Claire's mom now teaches, for denying athletic opportunities to women that attended the university. So it was brought under Title IX, the law that requires equity in education. And it was also brought under our state's Equal Rights Amendment. So in Washington State, we actually have a constitutional amendment that requires equality on the basis of gender. So that was how the organization was formed, and over time, as it gained resources, it started working in more and more areas. So for a long time, the organization has been very involved in reproductive rights advocacy in the Northwest states. As Clara mentioned, I work on various issues there, and my expertise is also in domestic and sexual violence, as well as anti-poverty work. So I wanted to mention also that as in my teaching role, I teach a class on reproductive rights, and as you can imagine, we're talking about difficult subjects in that class. I also teach poverty law, where we also talk about difficult subjects. We talk about race, we talk about gender, we talk about class, and so I always encourage my students to try to feel free to express their views in the most respectful way possible. And so I am putting that on my own self today. I don't intend to be disrespectful towards the people that don't support the right to abortion. I don't intend to be disrespectful to the people that work in or believe in the work of crisis pregnancy centers. And I would just ask that we all carry that level of respect towards one another as we think about a difficult topic today. So first of all, I got involved in this issue because when I started working at Legal Voice, I worked primarily on behalf of low-income women around access to health care. And so women called when they were trying to get Medicaid coverage for abortion, but also for a variety of other things, including prenatal care, wondering whether they were eligible for services. And over time, I noticed that, a small percentage, but still a remarkable amount of people had been to a crisis pregnancy center in their search for health care access. All of the women I talked to were low income. Some were eligible for Medicaid, but some were not. Some were teenage girls whose parents actually had insurance and they were insured, so they weren't eligible to get Medicaid coverage, or they didn't think they were. But they were afraid to tell their parents about what was going on. And so they were looking around without assistance for help with an unplanned pregnancy. And over time, I started to collect these stories, and then I reached out. I reached out to our local clinic providers, family planning clinics, whether they provided abortion or not, and said, are your clients coming in and telling you stories about experiences at crisis pregnancy centers? And they indeed were, and so we developed a form for people to fill out. And so we collected over several years a lot of stories about what happened. So here's a few today, and the majority of them were negative. There were a few people who had a positive experience, a few people who clearly understood what services they were going to receive at a crisis pregnancy center, and everybody reported that the people that worked in the crisis pregnancy center were warm and supportive and kind. So that was across the board. But many people had experienced some pretty intense deception about what they were going to receive at these organizations. So one woman contacted me from Washington State. She was a mother already. She had 2 children. She was low income. She had an unintended pregnancy and was in an abusive relationship. So she did not feel that she could have a baby. She couldn't support the child, and she also was very fearful of the father. She needed free services, and she saw the sign that said free pregnancy tests at the pregnancy center in her community. So she called, and when she called, she was encouraged to come in for an appointment, and she specifically on the call said, I'm looking for abortion services, and the organization's representative did not inform her that they don't provide referrals or provide abortions. So she scheduled an appointment, she got childcare, she took time off from work, and went to the organization. Now, there were a series of things that happened when she got there that clued her in that she was not at a place that was going to give her information about abortion. But what was most troubling to me was that she was encouraged to have the child and give the child up for adoption. And when she said, you know, I'm afraid of the father, I don't feel that that's a good idea, I don't think it would be safe for me and the child, she was told by the volunteer, in Washington State, you don't have to give notice to the father if you want to give the baby up for adoption, so you should just have the baby, and then you can give it up for adoption. And that's just flat out wrong. Moreover, the person is not in a position to be giving legal advice, right? But so she was very concerned, very fearful about this, didn't know if this was true or not, and ultimately did get the services she needed, but not after spending several hours at the crisis pregnancy center, and of course she never got a referral from that organization. Moreover, in Washington State, our Medicaid program covers abortions, and women understand that they have to go get a pregnancy test to verify that they're pregnant in order to get abortion coverage. So that also sends women into crisis pregnancy centers because they see the sign for free tests. So she also wanted the results of her test, and the crisis pregnancy center would not release them to her. So even though they are her own medical records, they refused to give them to her. So this was one of my first stories that I had heard, and I really didn't know anything about a crisis pregnancy center. And as I'll talk about later, people like me who had health insurance, who have professional degrees, who've had pregnancies, I had an OBGYN. I never went looking for free services or needing help. So to me, it was a pretty invisible issue, right? So this was my first kind of eye-opening moment with them. We also heard from a Spokane, Washington teenager who went to a crisis pregnancy center there, pregnant, and wanting to keep the baby. And while she was there, she was repeatedly discouraged from keeping her baby. She was told that teenagers don't know how to teenagers don't know how to parent. The father of the baby isn't going to stay with you. You should definitely give this baby up for adoption. It made her extremely uncomfortable, tearful in fact. She already was trying to do something that was really difficult, right? Be a teenage mother, face that, walk around pregnant. I mean, it was a very scary time for her. And she felt very, very disturbed by the experience she got there. She brought back materials with her, which she shared with us. A pamphlet, one of them in particular, is published by Focus on the Family. And it basically tries to talk young women out of keeping their own children, insisting that they're not going to be good parents. It's more loving to give up a baby for adoption at that age. Now, it is difficult to be a teen parent, no doubt about it, but we found this really quite disturbing as well, that this didn't seem an appropriate counseling service to provide to women in the circumstances. Certainly when she went there, she thought she was going there for medical care. She thought she would get prenatal care, not a dissuasion from actually raising her own child. I talked to a woman in Alaska, and this was a particularly distressing and compelling circumstance. Again, a mother already, very low income, lives in a very small town. Now, I don't know if you've ever been to Alaska, but there are times in the year where you actually can't drive out of your town and get to somewhere else. And she had to fly from her community to get to Anchorage, Alaska. So she had called looking for an abortion provider. The Crisis Pregnancy Center in Anchorage that took her call did not inform her that they were not an abortion provider, asked her to set up an appointment with them. So she bought a plane ticket, paid for a hotel, all of this on a credit card, didn't have any extra cash at all with her, flew all the way to Anchorage. Kind of later in her pregnancy, because it took her a long time to get all this organized, so she's pushing 12 weeks at this point. And arrives in Anchorage and, of course, is not provided an abortion and doesn't learn that she's not going to be provided one until she's actually on a table getting an ultrasound. And then when the people who are doing the ultrasound start to talk about your baby, isn't it beautiful, she starts to think, well, this doesn't seem like I'm getting medical care. And once she told them, no, I actually thought I was getting an abortion, I was here for that service, they just sent her out the door. So she's in Anchorage. Has to find a place to stay, to get back home the next day. Very, very low income. Again, doesn't have any food with her, didn't have any cash, very upsetting circumstance. Now, in Alaska, there are no providers of later term abortions. So she had to fly to Seattle to get an abortion at 13 or 14 weeks in order to exercise her rights. Another woman I talked with who actually testified in our legislature about our bill was a survivor of domestic violence who went to a crisis pregnancy center, also already a mother, already had one child with this very abusive person. What was very concerning there was that, number one, she was encouraged to come in and told she would get abortion services, and of course she did not. Also, there was no screening that went on for domestic violence, so she did not get any help. Now, in our testing of crisis pregnancy centers, we were actually very pleased to see that several crisis pregnancy centers in our state have a really good screening program for domestic violence, had the right list of referrals to send people for help. So I think that it actually isn't uniform across these organizations that this happens, but certainly in this person's circumstance, it was very disturbing. Another woman who came to our legislature to testify had a pregnancy that she wanted, was thrilled. She was in her early 30s. She wanted to get prenatal care. Again, in our state, if you're eligible for Medicaid and you want prenatal care, you have to go through this process of getting somebody to verify that you're pregnant. So she started calling around to try to find a provider that could get her in, and nobody could for a couple of weeks. And so she went to a crisis pregnancy center because they advertised free tests. She assumed what would happen there is that they'd give her the test, they'd give her the results, she'd go apply for her medical coupon, and she could get her prenatal care coverage going, and she could get to the clinic. But she wasn't married. And because she wasn't married, the crisis pregnancy center staff were very concerned about her, spiritual health. And so they made her wait in a room for 45 minutes, telling her that the test takes that long to get back. And while she's in the room, they questioned her about the father of the baby. Was he really going to stick around? And gave her abstinence-only materials. And she was sitting there saying, well, here I am pregnant. This doesn't really seem a service that I need. Can I just have my test results? And they would not give her her test results in writing. Again, withheld them from her, even though she intended to use them to get prenatal care coverage. So she was delayed about 3 weeks in accessing prenatal care. Not horrible, she was at the early part of her pregnancy, but you can imagine a circumstance like that where somebody actually was farther along and you could actually start to endanger the pregnancy and the baby. So those are some examples across the board of different things that go on at these organizations. And after hearing about this, we thought, we really should start looking into doing something about this. I mean, there's outreach we can do to try to educate people about what these organizations do and don't do. We can talk with the people that run these organizations and say, are you intentionally trying to trick people to come in the doors, or is there a way we can be more honest with the women that are coming to you to get your services? And we started looking at the background behind crisis pregnancy centers, because there's many of them. In Washington State, there are at least 40. I'm sure there are very many in Oklahoma as well. There's thousands of them across the country. So we looked back at the history, and we found that crisis pregnancy centers have been around for a long time, even before Roe versus Wade was decided in 1973, when states started to loosen the restrictions on abortion access. People who did not believe in abortion and the right to access abortion started creating alternative organizations, right? Crisis pregnancy centers that would offer women pro-life counseling. And that was absolutely clear at the beginning, that this was pro-life counseling. This was intended to discourage women from having abortions and encourage them to keep their pregnancies. The Pearson Foundation was the first nonprofit organization formed around crisis pregnancy centers, or at least the first that we know of, in the late 1960s, and the first crisis pregnancy center they opened was in Hawaii. Hawaii was one of the first states to loosen its restrictions on access to abortion pre-Roe. So the Pearson Foundation created a manual for how to open and how to start your own crisis pregnancy center, and that was the first time that the encouraging of deceptive tactics was really seen. So the manual actually says the person who is here is a killer who wants to kill her baby, and she's not entitled to any information about how to do that. The manual encourages the clinics to use names that sound like the names of abortion providers, to set up near or even in the same building as abortion providers and put up signs that might encourage her to come to your clinic thinking it's the abortion clinic rather than going to the reproductive health clinic that she has an appointment at. It basically encourages this sort of culture of tricking people to come into the door rather than telling them what your true intention is. I've provided a list of web resources that is out there. One of them links to a history of these organizations with the Pearson Manual so you can see it yourself. One of them also is a link to an HBO documentary called 12th in Delaware, which is actually very interesting, I think, from all perspectives, pro-life and pro-choice. It films a crisis pregnancy center across the street from an abortion clinic in a town in Florida. And you see there, the Crisis Pregnancy Center allowed the documentarians to come into a training that they were providing, and the question of deception came up. The volunteers that were being trained asked the trainer, is it okay to lie? Is it okay to tell her we're an abortion clinic and she should come in here? And the trainer basically, without saying yes, says yes, and says the same reason. It's our job to save babies and to rescue babies, and therefore you can do whatever you have to do to get women in the door. So again, this is the MO of many, not all, crisis pregnancy centers. And so some of these organizations in the 1980s and 1990s did in fact set up clinics with names that were extremely similar to Planned Parenthood or other providers, and some lawsuits were filed because of that. And so there were some successful lawsuits against some of these organizations, and there were some successful lawsuits against them also for advertising under abortion in the phone book. We didn't have the internet back then, right? So all the advertising and all the places women would go to would be yellow pages. And so because of those successful lawsuits, crisis pregnancy centers have, for the most part, stopped advertising under abortion in the phone book and don't use names that are totally identical to Planned Parenthood or other clinics. However, they do often use the word clinic in their title. And so that leads me to talk about our investigation that we did of the crisis pregnancy centers in Washington State, just to see what it was like, what happens when somebody goes into one of these organizations. This is the printed version of that report, The Deceptive Practices of Limited Service Pregnancy Centers, which is the name we use for the organizations to be a little more clear that you're getting a limited service at this organization. The link to this web report is on the resource list that I brought. So what we did was we recruited a lot of volunteers, young women, a few young men as well, that went with their partners to conduct an investigation. And we trained them. We trained them to be open-minded. We trained them to not record what happened during, using electronic means, but to just write down everything that happened during their visit or their phone call immediately afterwards. We trained them to not lie, to not try to give a false pregnancy test or something like that. And we asked them to report back what they had, what they discovered. And this is the sort of typical thing that we'd found. For the most part, most organizations did not, even when directly asked, admit to being a crisis pregnancy center that did not provide or refer for abortion or birth control. But in fact, all of the organizations did in fact not provide abortion. They do not provide birth control, and they don't refer for either of those services. They also provide information about abortion and birth control, but we found that in every crisis pregnancy center that was visited or that provided information over the phone, that information was either false or misleading. About abortion, about miscarriage, about pregnancy, about birth control, about emergency contraception. as well. And again, some misleading legal information as well, or incorrect in the case I talked about earlier. That didn't happen as often, but it wasn't uncommon to hear Crisis Pregnancy Center volunteers tell our testers that you can get an abortion all the way to the 9th month of pregnancy and that there's no rush, and that's just not true as a matter of law, in addition to being a health problem. But we found that another thing that was really typical was delaying tactics. So suggesting that the woman should definitely come in, but she should probably take a second pregnancy test in a few weeks to confirm whether she was really pregnant. Crisis pregnancy centers that we tested on their websites and on the phone frequently told women that 25 to 30% of pregnancies actually end in miscarriage anyway, so you should just wait. Which is not inaccurate to say that a large portion of pregnancies, early pregnancy, ends in miscarriage, but it's misleading to suggest that, first of all, the person who's called you has probably noticed her symptoms and is probably past the point, and so that the percentage of likelihood of a miscarriage is a lot lower. It also ignores the fact that you actually have a health condition going on when you're pregnant, right? And if there is a risk of miscarriage, you need to get into a doctor and get some help with that. So it's not really, to say to a pregnant woman, just hold on and see what happens, is not proper medical advice. Another delaying tactic is to say to women after they've had a positive pregnancy test, please come back for an ultrasound, but we can't do it for you for 2 or 3 or 4 weeks. Right? So just making it harder for a woman to exercise a decision to have an abortion in the early part of her pregnancy when it's safer and more available and less expensive. A lot of the information is misleading medical information or false medical information is in this report, and you can look at it. But just to mention some of it, it's very, very common for crisis pregnancy centers to tell women that abortions cause breast cancer, future infertility, and trauma. And the science rejects all 3 of those across the board. And I looked at one Oklahoma Crisis Pregnancy Center website here, and it was Pregnancy Resource Center of Southwestern Oklahoma. So they had information on their website about abortion. And all of the citations were to other crisis pregnancy centers and other crisis pregnancy center pamphlets. So the same kind of thing I just talked about here is stated, but without really any support or citation. Now, the other thing that you see a lot of organizations do is give misleading information about emergency contraception. Now, so Plan B is the brand name. There is also a new drug, Ella, but Plan B is the brand name of the contraception that's given post-intercourse to prevent a pregnancy. Now, a lot of people who are pro-life feel very strongly that any interference with potential implantation of a fertilized egg or even implantation or interference with fertilization is wrong, and that is their moral belief. Okay, so not casting aspersions on that. But a lot of the information that's given to try to discourage women from getting Plan B is actually inaccurate. So on this same website that I looked at, the organization conflates Plan B with RU486, the abortion pill. The abortion pill, RU486, does cause an abortion. That's absolutely what it is for. However, it is not distributed at pharmacies. You have to go get it from a medical provider, and it is not at all the same as Plan B. In fact, they're the opposite kinds of drug. Plan B is actually a progestin. Progestin means progestation, right? So progestin would encourage pregnancy. So actually, in findings across the nation and across the world, Plan B has never harmed anybody. Plan B does not harm an existing pregnancy. Certainly, you don't want to take it if you're pregnant. You want to screen out somebody who's pregnant, but only because you don't want to be adding hormones into your body, not because it will harm or cause an abortion. In fact, it can't because it's a progestin. So telling women that they're the same is wrong and misleading, and it may be just a misunderstanding on the part of the Crisis Pregnancy Center, but that's exactly why we don't want them to be providing inaccurate medical information. We want them to understand what they're talking about. The other thing that this website and others say is that women are hurt by Plan B, that Plan B has caused birth defects. Again, no, it doesn't harm an existing pregnancy. That Plan B causes women to have ectopic pregnancies, and there's a study that totally debunks that. So lots of misinformation about that particular drug. Now, some pamphlets that I've read just talk about the moral issues and the beliefs, and that seems perfectly fine to say, because this drug works We're not sure how it works. It might work to prevent implantation, even though the science is really kind of against that as well. It might work that way, and so we're concerned. We think if you have this belief against abortion, you might want to know this about this drug. Some pamphlets are focused on that, but many of the organizations we tested provide the really false information about that drug and scare women into thinking that it's actually dangerous to their physical health. I'm just pulling out a couple of, kind of very shocking quotes that about the things that our testers were told had to do with the issue of STIs, sexually transmitted infections, and HIV/AIDS. There was a lot of information given both in writing and over the phone and in person about how condoms don't work. And most of that focuses on saying that they don't work to prevent pregnancy. And so failure rates are exaggerated or just claims that are made that are not at all true. And in fact, the Center for Disease Control website refutes many of those claims. But what was, I think, most disturbing and alarming to us was that a few volunteers told people that condoms don't help protect from HIV and AIDS. And one tester said, the AIDS virus goes through a condom like water through the holes of a tennis racket. Totally irrational and totally scientifically wrong. And so from our perspective, that's really a public health question, right? You don't want to discourage people from using condoms. Like if you're teaching abstinence, fine, but we know not everybody is abstinent. You certainly don't want to be giving false information about that kind of reproductive health question. So given all the things that we found, and given the experiences of the women that I had talked to, and knowing kind of the history at the national level of what's been going on with these organizations, we sat down in our state to try to figure out how to grapple with this. Because we don't want to shut down crisis pregnancy centers. We don't want to stop people from sharing their beliefs and their views. We don't want any organization that purports to provide medical care to lie to women about what it does and doesn't do. How do they get away with this? Well, they're wholly unregulated. There's no regulations in my state. I really don't know Oklahoma law. There are no regulations in my state that govern any activities of a crisis pregnancy center. Unlike reproductive health clinics, which are regulated with a stack of this big of statutes and regulations, particularly if they get federal funding, right? All kinds of things. And in Washington State, we don't regulate abortion clinics the way people do in these states, right? In your state, I know that abortion clinics have to comply with a lot more regulations than they do in Washington State. So unlike the clinics that are providing reproductive health care, or like doctors or nurses who are regulated because they have professional licenses, most of our crisis pregnancy centers don't have any medical staff. They may have a doctor on their advisory board, but that doctor is never present providing services or supervising the provision of services. All of the services in almost every crisis pregnancy center in my state are provided by volunteers. Some of them have a nurse on staff who does some of the activities, though they're providing obstetrical ultrasounds in many of these sites, but often those are they're not provided by anyone but a trained volunteer as well. So there's no mechanism essentially for the state to regulate or enforce at present what goes on in these organizations. We also were really concerned about the report I mentioned about withholding women's medical records. And so we started to look into that and asked our testers to look into that. Well, in fact, our testers brought back for us the forms that they got at the crisis pregnancy centers that explicitly say, we will not give you your medical record if we think you're going to use it for an abortion. And some of them cited one law, some of them cited another, one of them cited the Constitution and free exercise clause to support this argument that they didn't have to provide women their medical records. Now, not giving someone your medical record is a violation of our state law, and it's a violation of HIPAA, the federal law around medical records privacy. If you fall under the definitions of creating a medical record and being a healthcare provider under those laws, crisis pregnancy centers don't. They don't have any trained staff. They don't provide medical services other than this free pregnancy test and the ultrasound. So while as a lawyer I could think, well, I could argue that maybe they're providing these services, the truth is the statutes weren't designed at all to address what goes on at a crisis pregnancy center. And yet, what is being created is a medical record. We're also concerned because that's very private information, right? All of our testers were asked for their medical history, their name, address, phone number, all of that private information. And again, if that's not protected by HIPAA or state law, then we're concerned about that as well. Now, many of the crisis pregnancy centers we tested actually voluntarily state in their forms that they will follow the state medical records privacy law, but for giving you your records. Right? So they claim that they're protecting women's privacy, and I have never heard of an instance where they have not, where they've shared the records, except for a couple of women I spoke to who were phoned at home, and one was a teenager, and her parents got the call by the crisis pregnancy center after she'd been to check on her and see how she was doing without her authorization. So that I have heard of happening, and that would be a HIPAA violation were these organizations governed by HIPAA. So, you know, we're thinking, okay, they're not governed by any kind of professional laws that govern clinics. They're not regulated in any way. They don't have healthcare providers that have licenses that can regulate, and they're not following medical records privacy laws. So let's kind of craft something to regulate the organizations, right? Surely we know that many communities appreciate some of the services they provide. On the good side, like I mentioned earlier, some of them are referring women to domestic violence agencies and are providing a very supportive, caring environment when they go into a crisis pregnancy center. Some of them are providing baby clothes, strollers, other materials. Some of them are providing parenting classes, things that are good in the community and people want. So the idea is keep the organization there doing those things, just make sure that women know the ideology of the organization, the lack of medical care, that you're not going to have a doctor, you're not going to see a doctor or a nurse if you go to this organization. That's the mission behind our attempt to regulate. So, you know, and then thinking about who you're trying to help. When you're looking at crisis pregnancy centers. Again, the person that goes to a crisis pregnancy center are typically not those of us in this audience and me, the people who have resources, the people who have a doctor already, the people who have a nurse practitioner, other care providers, the people who have family support for a pregnancy, whether it's unintended or not, right? It's people who are often really alone and are turning to somebody for help, who don't have money, who don't have resources, who may be very young teenagers. And so that's a pretty vulnerable group of people in society, and that's a vulnerable group of people who, you know, have been willing to come to our legislature and say, what happened to me was not okay, I think this organization should be regulated. So that's who we're trying to work with and protect by creating regulations around crisis pregnancy centers. So the other thing we're trying to do, I think, is make sure that we don't have any disastrous outcomes. So, you know, if you are getting an ultrasound and you're miscarrying, and the person providing you the ultrasound is untrained and can't identify that you're miscarrying, you won't get referred to a healthcare provider. And often, if you are miscarrying, you need medical follow-up to make sure that, that you are not in need of a surgery. Or that you might need some medications to help. You might need pain medications. There's a lot of things that you may need following a miscarriage. And so we're really concerned that somebody's going to miss something really important and someone's going to get hurt. And that, you know, women are entitled not just to the dignity of being treated respectfully and honestly, but also to have quality medical care and to understand that the medical care they're getting is going to really give them the information that they need. We also are really concerned about, of course, women being delayed from accessing whether it's prenatal care or abortion care. The delay is really troubling, and so we want to eliminate that problem as well. So legislative efforts then. In Washington State, we have for 2 years lobbied for a bill that has not yet passed that would require certain things of crisis pregnancy centers. Number one, bring them under our medical records privacy law. You can't withhold women's medical records, and you have to protect their privacy. So that's number one. Number two, post in your clinic and on your website, on your homepage prominently, that you don't provide abortion or birth control or referrals for those services, and you're not a prenatal care provider. The other thing that it would do is require the posting of those signs in other languages. We worked really closely with our reproductive justice community around what would serve lower income communities as well as women of color, immigrant women, and we decided that we would ask the crisis pregnancy centers to use the top 3 languages in the county where they work. We have many, many languages in Seattle, so we can't really legitimately ask anyone to post a sign in 20 different languages. But the top 3 seemed at least it would reach more people, right? So in whatever county you're in, you've got to use those languages. We also asked that the Crisis Pregnancy Center tell women if they're actually using a home pregnancy test for testing, because some of them do. And if they are using a home pregnancy test, the kind you can buy at the grocery store, you have to give it to the woman herself and let her choose to do it herself if she wants to. Right? Because part of this delay thing is this idea that you have to sit and wait 30 minutes, 45 minutes, 50 minutes for a test that only takes a couple of minutes. And so we felt that it's better for the woman to self-test if she wants to and have that information immediately available to her. Again, some of them use lab tests from our testing process we discovered. So this doesn't apply to every crisis pregnancy center, only the ones that are using home pregnancy tests. So that's the Washington state bill that hasn't yet passed. And there's similar bills that have been dropped in state legislatures that have not yet passed as well. No state has yet passed a regulation scheme like this at all. However, some cities have, and you've probably heard this as it's been in the news. The first to do so was the city of Baltimore and Montgomery County, Maryland. So the county council passed an ordinance, likewise the city. Then the city of Austin followed. The city of New York followed, and just recently the city of San Francisco. Now, Seattle, we're not going to pursue that there because we actually don't have any crisis pregnancy centers in Seattle. There was one and it closed up shop and moved out. So we don't actually have that in our city. So for us, it's a problem more of women who live in rural communities and in South Sound regions. So we're not going to pursue that city strategy there. But the city ordinances have been challenged one by one. First Baltimore, then Montgomery County, then New York, now Austin. San Francisco's just passed. I'm not even sure it's in effect yet, but I'm sure we'll see a lawsuit there too. I'd be surprised if we didn't. The lawsuits have been filed by various entities, but pretty much litigated by the same national entities. The Alliance Defense Fund, Americans United for Life, have been involved in helping bring the lawsuits. And the Archdiocese in Baltimore was the main client and the plaintiff in that particular case. And so far, there have been 2 court decisions enjoining these laws and finding them to violate the free speech rights of the volunteers that work at the crisis pregnancy centers. And the ordinances, the Washington law I described is similar to the ordinances, not identical, to the ordinances passed in New York and Baltimore. Now, the judges in both cases, these are on appeal to the circuit court, so this is not a definitive ruling yet. But the judges in both cases were concerned primarily about the content of the issue that we're dealing with here and said that abortion-related speech is political speech, and they refused to find that the speech involved was commercial, which was the argument that we have made and others have made, that in fact, you're advertising a service, and in the advertising of that service, even if the service is not exchanged for money, you are creating a consumer protection issue, right? And that consumers of that service should have a right to know what they're going to be provided when they come to the crisis pregnancy center. Now, the courts have said, well, this is actually political speech, not commercial, because these organizations are actually just trying to promote an agenda, a pro-life agenda, not provide medical care, which is interesting because that's sort of the same thing that many on our side say, but basically said, you can't regulate that absent a compelling interest and that you narrowly tailor the law. So in New York, the judge actually said, this is compelling. It's actually a compelling interest to protect women's health, and I actually do think that some of these activities are deceitful. And the crisis pregnancy centers admonished the judge, should stop saying that they're not, because they are deceitful, these particular practices. But the judge said, this is not narrowly tailored enough, because all crisis pregnancy centers have to comply with it, not just the ones that have done deceptive tactics, right? So the judge said, look, some of these organizations are out here doing good work, and they're totally honest, and that's our experience too. In fact, when we tested, one organization in Walla Walla, Washington was so clear, couldn't be more clear, on the phone, in person, on their website, about their mission, their religious identity, and what their goal was. So there are some that are like that, and so the judge said, you're casting the net too widely, essentially. Again, it remains to be seen what happens. I don't have time to get into my own analysis of why the courts were wrong, and I won't. I actually do think they are incorrect, but it will remain to be seen what the circuit courts say. But nonetheless, San Francisco continued and passed its bill. We are still urging our bill in Washington State Legislature, and other bills are going on in other states. So, even though we haven't passed those bills, I do think some good things have come out of it. One good thing that's come out of it is that we have raised the public awareness of the deceptive practices of some crisis pregnancy centers, right? And we've also got the crisis pregnancy centers to come forward, because they came forward en masse to fight this legislation. And many stepped up and said, you know what, we're going to put a doctor on site all the time. Or we actually have a doctor on site all the time, and we're going to make sure everybody knows that. And some, interestingly enough, over the course of my work on this, I have seen the websites evolve quite a bit. Many of the organizations in our states now put on their homepage, we don't provide or refer for abortion. So I feel very happy that there's at least more information that's being provided out there. There's some shift in some of the tactics used by the organizations. And so what we urge and what we think about is, how to address some of the remaining problems, right? We don't think that women's health should be put at risk. We don't think that women's autonomy is served by being tricked. And, we want to stop that. We want to stop the deception that's used by some of these organizations. But we also want to, use this opportunity to reach out and say to crisis pregnancy centers or to pro-life people that, we have opportunities to partner, because we do all care about, at root, health in our communities. We care about the low-income people that we are all serving, whose needs aren't getting met in a system that doesn't provide health care for everyone, in a system that doesn't provide subsidized child care, that doesn't provide a real safety net. I mean, there's all kinds of suffering that goes on after a child is born that we can all partner around. So we also use the opportunity, now that we've met face-to-face with our crisis pregnancy centers, to make those connections. And I'll give you just one quick example, and then I'll stop talking. We brought a bill in Washington State to end the shackling of incarcerated women who were giving birth. They were shackled to beds while they're laboring and delivering their babies. And we were shocked to discover this was happening, as was our legislature, and the bill sailed fairly quickly through. But this was the first time in my career I had ever received an email from the head of Human Life of Washington, our pro-life lobbying entity, sent an email to me saying, "Great work." I was floored. And so I sent an email back, and we had this great dialogue. And then some of the same people were there when we were there talking about the crisis pregnancy center. And one woman actually approached me and said, we really do agree on some things. Let's try to work together. And we haven't been able to do that yet. I don't know what we necessarily might work on next together, but I feel like that there's those moments where we come together around an issue where our concern for women and children and concern for unborn babies on the part of pro-life people can actually meet at a point of policy making. And so I guess I feel hopeful, though I am chagrined still not to have this regulation in place, that we can at least move forward, and at least we move the conversation forward. So thank you, and I'm happy to answer questions. And I don't know if people wrote them down, but...
I work as a nurse, and I have in the past done ultrasounds on some older equipment, and it can be very, very difficult to miss ectopic pregnancies.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you know of any cases where, and I mean, I went through 4 years of school to be able to do that.
Yeah.
I can't imagine somebody that's just being trained as a volunteer. Like, it scares me how easy it is to miss it after I've done all of this training. Have there been cases where volunteers have missed ectopic pregnancies?
I have never heard of that. I think it's a real fear. What I think is, yeah?
Could you repeat your question?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, let me repeat your question. So she's a nurse, and she went through 4 years of training to do ultrasounds, and noted that it's very, very difficult when doing an ultrasound to catch an ectopic pregnancy, and it can be easily missed, even for someone who's trained. The ultrasound issue could probably take another hour's worth of time to talk about, but it is interesting. Most crisis pregnancy centers that I've seen, and I haven't heard of that happening, though I too fear that, they're really clear at the point the woman is on the table that the person doing the ultrasound is only doing it to measure gestational age and doesn't have any other training and is going to be non-diagnostic. But most women don't know that until they get there. So there is some disclosure that goes on, in our experience anyway. But certainly some of our local healthcare providers and other communities have expressed some real concern about the risk to women's health posed by untrained ultrasound volunteers. And in fact, the New York judge in the case was just apoplectic over the fact that New York has no regulations governing ultrasound provision, and said, this is a place you need to get into right now and fix this. And most states do not. most states, it's mostly a standard of care, right, for your profession that regulates how ultrasounds are provided. So I do think it's a real risk to people. Moreover, but it gets back again to the point about deception, right? If you just are clear with women about what this actually is going to be, this is more like the ultrasound at the mall, right? They're just taking a photo of the baby. That's what this is meant to be. If women know that, then maybe some of that concern is obviated, because then the woman will go to a healthcare provider to get the diagnostic ultrasound she needs. Okay. I have some other questions up here. One was, can you send copy of the law proposed in Washington State? Yes, definitely. And it's also cited on the list outside. You can just look at it on the legislature's website. It's up there, and all of the bill history, et cetera, is up there, and I have the link on a handout out there. Another question is, what federal or state laws are in place currently to regulate these clinics? And doesn't the woman or the consumer have a right to get accurate information? Otherwise, it is consumer fraud. Great question. Every state has consumer protection laws. There are federal consumer protection laws as well. Those federal laws were the ones used in the early lawsuits I talked about against using a deceptive name and pretending to be another clinic, and advertising under abortion in the phone book, right? So those are the early laws that address some of the activities. We have done a lot of legal analysis of the consumer protection laws in the region that we cover, so Washington, Oregon, Montana, Idaho, and Alaska. Most of those laws would sustain a lawsuit probably brought on behalf of a woman who is injured, or maybe not even injured, but just deceived by the activities of a crisis pregnancy center. Some of the state laws, though, really do tighten and limit their consumer protection laws to organizations that are charging for their services. So that's a hole, essentially, in those legal protections, where any nonprofit that's providing free services can just fall through. So it's not that's not actually an easy question to answer, but it's a good one. The question is, what are your thoughts on personhood amendments being pushed in some states? So yes, there's one in Mississippi right now that people are voting on. Wow. I don't know that I can answer that in the time allotted. Obviously, I oppose personhood amendments for eggs, embryos, and fetuses. I think it undermines women's rights. But I think it gets back to, again, the broader question of why we defend women's rights to reproductive choice. And so much of that is about women's equality and autonomy and the history of women being subordinated in our culture, and that we haven't really truly ended that yet, and that it is essential to women's humanity to have the ability to control their reproductive lives. I think that and I also, having been a pregnant person and a mom, I also feel that it really doesn't make sense to treat an embryo or a fetus as a separate, totally outside entity. That doesn't to me comport well with my understanding and experience of pregnancy. I think pregnancy is a unique status, both legally and physically, and that's something that these kinds of laws and protections ignore. So, and again, I think that's a way of just ignoring women's humanity. Yeah.
Is there any regulations in the state about who provides medical care? Because with the ultrasounds, my first question was, how can someone that's not a trained professional be providing a service that's clearly medical related? Because I've worked with Outside In Oregon for Project Erase, and we had to go jump through so many hoops to get this project, because parts of it were medical related, parts of it weren't, but we had to have so many regulations that we had to follow because part of the procedure was medical related.
Sure. That's a great question. So the question is, aren't there laws that regulate the practice of medicine and govern who gets to practice it, right? Well, in fact, there are, right? And so many of the things I have described, or many of the things we've seen and experienced at these organizations, cross the line. So we have had women who've had a diagnosis given to them by the untrained volunteer from an ultrasound, like saying, oh, you're probably going to miscarry. I don't see, there's a wavy line here. I don't even know what that meant, but this was one of the examples. There's a wavy line here. You're probably going to miscarry. That person has violated laws that prohibit the unauthorized practice of medicine. So what's the solution, though? The woman has to file a complaint with the Department of Health, and they go through this big investigative process, and then there's maybe a fine imposed. So while that's not necessarily a bad thing, it's not necessarily an effective strategy to discourage deception across the state and across organizations. Yeah, so when there and when there.
So with statutes that have been passed, I know that we have one here in Oklahoma with regard to wrongful life, and provide some sort of civil immunity for doctors or medical providers that misrepresent or even lie intentionally to women about the health of their fetus. Have any of those laws around the nation been used to insulate any medical providing or medical actions taken at crisis pregnancy centers?
No, that's a very interesting question, and I have not seen anything like that. You know, there aren't a lot of lawsuits that have been filed around crisis pregnancy centers, and that's not something I've seen at all. And again, it's not common, and not every state has a law like that. So that'd be a very interesting question to look at. Thanks for asking it. Yeah. And you had a question, and then you, yeah.
I want to commend you for stating several times that not all crisis pregnancy centers use deceitful practices.
That's true.
I'm a law student here. Nearly 30 years ago, in the early 80s, I set up a crisis pregnancy center here in Oklahoma that is still serving women, and I'm proud to say it does not use deceitful practices. It provides a wide range of supportive services, including housing to pregnant women. I think that deceit should not be used on either side. And so I think to the degree that you clarify that there are many CPCs that do not use deceitful services, that would strengthen your presentation. It's not just some, it's many. And some of the handouts emphasize the use of federal funds. I do not know any CPCs here in Oklahoma receiving federal funds. So that's not an issue that I'm aware of here in our state. But I do think it's important that women have access to information about the full range of their choices. And I'm not sure that all abortion clinics are as good at providing information on the full range of choices any more than some CPCs provide information on the full range of choices. And I think both sides need to work harder to do that so that women make truly informed decisions.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate the commendation. And I use the term "some" very intentionally, being a lawyer. I use the term "some" because in Washington we tested more than half of the crisis pregnancy centers in our state, and we found false information provided at every single one that we tested, except for the one that I mentioned, the one in Walla Walla. So I do, in our state, feel that "some" is an appropriate word rather than "many." However, if speaking on a national level, you're right. I would need to research that more carefully before I use that term. And I appreciate very much that there are crisis pregnancy centers like the one you've described that are honest about their services. And again, there's clearly a need. There's clearly a need that is drawing people for assistance and information. So I definitely hear that. There was one question back here. Yeah.
It would strike me that if you deceive a woman to the extent that she allows a certain level of touching to go on in the context of testing or other kinds of, quote, diagnosis, that there's been an unlawful battery. And I don't know if that's been tested or not.
We haven't tested it, but we researched that same question, particularly because some of these ultrasounds are quite invasive, actually. And you know, at this point, in talking to the women that I've spoken with, very few felt safe pursuing public or legal action. And so even when I talked with them about potential claims, they're afraid to do that. Even if I say, well, there's Jane Doe status, there's ways of protecting your privacy, I think, understandably so, I would be very loath to be involved in any lawsuit whatsoever. And I think that so that's really a barrier, I think, for people, for us to be able to test some of those ideas. But yes, I think that's right. If the informed consent is a very big issue about what is happening at these organizations. So you had a question, yeah?
Is there a difference between abortion information? Is there a legal definition for that? Or can they say they provide abortion information and simply give out pamphlets on abstinence? Or how does that?
They can currently because there are no regulations whatsoever. Okay. I mean, in Washington State, there's no regulation around what I've described. The idea behind these signage laws is to try to address some of that, to say, you know, to a person, look, this organization may provide information, but they're not a referral source for abortion, and that's a clue, right, about what kind of services you're going to get. So that's a good question. And then you?
I was curious about the liability, and are there companies that provide liability insurance policies for people like this? And maybe this gentleman knows.
Yeah, maybe you don't.
I know as a minister, you know, our church has it, and as a minister, because if I give counseling, even free counseling,
Right.
you know, I could be sued. So I was just wondering if there are companies that provide that.
I don't know. I mean, I know, what I do know is that there are many lawyers on the advisory boards of these organizations in my state, and I'm assuming someone's thinking about that stuff and being cautious about it. I'm assuming that's why they created these forms that say they follow medical records privacy, but I don't know about insurance.
Y'all have
I'm not
liability?
involved in that one at this time.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, and back there?
Two questions. Number one, when a woman goes to one of these crisis pregnancy centers, do they fill out any kind of, or do they sign any kind of waiver, giving up any of their rights at all? Are there any waivers that are signed by any of these people?
We looked very closely at that. That's one of the things we asked testers to do, was collect all the forms you're given and please bring them back so I could review them. There was some of them had informed consent type forms that basically explain, you're not getting medical care, this is all done by trained volunteers, sign here that you understand this. Not all of them did. None of them had any kind of liability waivers whatsoever.
Okay, the second question then is, if a person is a volunteer, unpaid, and are trained, ostensibly trained to give medical advice that could either positively or potentially injure the woman's health, and I find it difficult to believe that there's not some law in Washington State that prevents and makes a person like that in that situation liable for giving false medical information that is harmful to the person's health. It's like setting up a crisis appendicitis center and, you know, the volunteer giving you a gastroenterology textbook and a mirror and a grapefruit spoon and saying, go out and do it yourself.
Well,
I mean, there isn't that a possibility? I mean,
yes, that is absolutely a possibility. So I had described, in Washington, we have this unauthorized practice of medicine statute. And then we also have a common law of negligence, right? So there's potentially common law negligence claims. Again, it's, do the women want to bring them, is the issue that I have discovered. We actually went and met with our Department of Health, with the lawyers that run the unauthorized practice of medicine licensing division, and talked with them about, you know, here's the examples of all of the things. And they said, well, yeah, if you complain about this and we see this happening, then yeah, we think that violates that statute. The statute doesn't have any kind of private cause of action, though, so our state has to enforce it through the Department of Health. And while I think they would enforce it, again, the difficulty has been with women telling me about their story in a timely manner. I often don't hear from someone until past the time when it's appropriate to file a complaint. So that's why I mean, I have spent years trying to figure out how to resolve this, and it's very difficult. But all the things you raise, I think, are out there as potential solutions. But it struck us finally, after trying to get there, that the best way to go out about this is to have an actual regulation that clearly governs some of the activities of these organizations. But yeah, you're absolutely right. There certainly are causes of action that could be brought. Okay, yeah.
Well, that was my thought. We regulate tattooing, acupuncture, music therapy now in the state. And so are these, I guess in thinking along that line, I would ask too, are these not-for-profits? Are they 501c3s? Are they for-profits? Someplace they have to be paying taxes, or they would have to have some sort of zoning regulations and things like that. Do they not? Do we not regulate them that way?
They are 501c3s, so they're regulated through the IRS tax code, through the tax code that way, but that doesn't affect where they set up or what they provide. In my state, there's no zoning regulation, nothing. So some of the organizations are in clinic-type buildings where people wear lab coats and there's medical equipment around, so women really think they're in a clinic. Some of them, the ones I think are actually less deceptive, are set up in a little house and there's a big cross hanging on the door, and you know, it's a comfy living room that you go in and you're getting counseling, right? But at the same time, in our state too, we regulate all kinds of counselors, right? And still, the definitions though don't quite encompass what happens at crisis pregnancy centers. And that's another thing that we've spent a lot of time educating our legislators about, explaining, here's all the different laws that you've passed over the years to try to regulate conduct that you're concerned about consumers, and here's how crisis pregnancy centers so far have not fallen into the definitions. And so we need to expand that to encompass some of their activities. So back there.
I didn't want to ask a question.
There's
I just
time.
wanted to remind people to fill out the evaluation form and hand them to me as you leave.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so you had a question back there?
Have you said you were be interested in working with pro-life people on issues? I was thinking one of the biggest issues in this sphere that you could work on is the ultrasound. Like, if they really care about the health of the fetus, providing an inaccurate, unregulated ultrasound could cause the fetus lots of medical issues. You know, couldn't you work with them along those lines that by not having a trained professional provide this, you're not only putting the woman's health in jeopardy, but that fetus?
That's a really brilliant idea. I had not clicked on that one as a particular point of agreement, but I think that's really true. That's really true, and especially because they're providing those kinds of ultrasounds as a matter of their own desire, I think, to show women an accurate picture of what pregnancy is like, right? So this idea of accuracy and integrity is a good one.
And I'm sure a trained professional can offer a better, clearer description of the fetus than some volunteer that's had a weekend course.
Right, that's right. Yes.
I've worked with the pro-choice forces here in Oklahoma for many years, and those organizations who provide either abortion services or information about those services have almost to all that I know of have always provided a full range of information, including adoption affiliates. And so I think it's clear. I can't answer for what's going on nationwide, but in this state that's been the practice, and have been very supportive of women who had other choices. And I don't know anybody in the groups I've worked with who celebrate the existence of abortion.
Right.
They celebrate access of women's right to choose.
That's right.
And so they're not organizations dedicated to promoting large numbers of abortions or anything. It's simply to promote access to information and a service. And those organizations also have a presumption that when women have come to the stage where they have identified where those services are, they've thought through a lot of this.
Yeah.
And we want to respect the dignity of their thought process as a human being.
Thank you very much. I mean, that's one thing, too, that I always say when asked, well, no, you don't, you just want to shut down crisis pregnancy centers. And I say, well, no, I don't want to discourage anybody from talking to women about what they believe or their feelings. I trust that every woman has the intelligence and the ability to sort out the information she's given from all sources and decide what to do. It's when that information is actually false and intentionally misleading and designed to delay her that I have a problem. So, thank you. Yes.
I'm sorry, but I can't help but think that if in the past investigators have gone out and received information in 22 of 23 crisis pregnancy centers that they're giving false and misleading and inaccurate medical advice to potential patients, why don't you do that again with concealed cameras and tape recorders, make your report, file a lawsuit enjoining these agencies from giving false medical, like the lady up here, 4 years it takes to train to do ultrasounds. And somebody that reads it off the back of a wheeze box comes in and tells somebody that you've got a problem here, or you don't have a problem here, when there really is one.
Yeah.
And why has there not been a push to physically investigate these outfits and write reports and put them all together and roll them into one piece of litigation and hit them all at the same time?
Well, I think that is an ongoing strategy, actually. There's an accumulation of reports like this one, and I've cited many of them on the resource form, but it's still at the beginning stages, so only a few states have done it. Moreover, in our state, it's illegal to record anybody without their permission. So we can't do hidden cameras or anything like that in our state. And the other side can't do it to
Well,
abortion clinics either. But we're not the only state.
It's illegal
Yeah.
to record without one party to the record's permission. Now, I mean, that's the way it is in Oklahoma, but
Yeah, it's different in Washington, but I know I'm getting the cutoff signal
lip
from
reading
everybody.
would
So, if there were any other questions, I mean, I will be here for a few more minutes, we can talk. But I really appreciate all these great questions and all this great thought, and it's super fun to be here and talk to you all about it, so thank you.